all know many months ago the Prime Minister and the Liberal government invoked the Emergencies Act to get rid of the convoy that was plaguing downtown Ottawa, and I don't think the threshold has been met. We said that as the official opposition at the time. It did not meet the criteria to invoke the Emergencies Act. We still don't believe that. Talk about that. We have Raquel Dancho, Member of Parliament for Kildonan St. Paul, so the public safety critic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Jamie. It's wonderful to be back, and it's exciting news that the inquiries got started and we can really get to the bottom of what happened. And I don't think the Liberals were always being very honest, so we're quite interested to see what is discovered through this inquiry.
I think a few articles have already come out in the National Post and others saying that the bar has not been met, and this is a pretty early indication as the public inquiry goes on. Many people are already coming to that conclusion. The bar was not met. Like the protests at the border, Coutts, Alberta, and the Ambassador Bridge, they were cleared before the Emergencies Act. And now I'm going to read this from Blacklock's reporter that came out this morning, that the Freedom Convoy organizers were complying with a city agreement. So the City of Ottawa made an agreement to move the trucks away the very day that Cabinet declared a national emergency. And that was the Ottawa City Manager who told the inquiry that yesterday.
Very interesting, and I think there's going to be more of this coming out. And, you know, I think it's interesting, Jamie, because many people don't understand that the Emergencies Act is a follow-up to the War Measures Act. So it's our modern-day War Measures Act, which is the most powerful law in the land, designed for the absolute worst-case scenarios. So if you think about it like it's hard to think about, but if something like an invasion or like a mass telecommunications collapse or even, deadly pandemic, those are the types of things that governments may be justified in the most extreme circumstances to need to curtail charter rights in order to protect the greater national security framework. But the problem is that, of course, as you outlined, we don't believe that threshold was met during the Freedom Convoy protests in Ottawa. And as you've said, certainly there were the border blockades, which were illegal. And of course, as Conservatives, we condemn any blockades of railways, pipelines, bridges, roadways. That being said, those were effectively cleared without any emergency powers. So that sort of economic argument that the Liberal government had been making was a non-starter because those powers were not needed. The RCMP were able to effectively clear those. Now, if you talk about the demonstration in Ottawa, certainly many residents of Ottawa, I live in Ottawa half the time, so do you. We were living in Ottawa at this time. Some people believed it was, very traumatizing for them, and that's fair enough. They have every right to feel that way. No one is downplaying that this was a significant event in Ottawa. The question is, did it constitute a national emergency, as I've just discussed? And we don't believe that it did, and therefore the invocation of the Act and the powers therein were not justified.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point. Like, this is supposed to be a piece of legislation that has national implications, right? From a major incident that would happen that would affect a large majority of the population. Agreed. There were some blocks within Ottawa that had very difficult times, according to the testimony. But at the same time, it did not have the same implications, even in your province of Manitoba.
Right, and I think that's a really key piece. And again, the two sort of the thresholds that have to be met are either an economic one or public safety one. And if the demonstration in Ottawa was a threat to public safety, would they have really allowed members of Parliament, the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, members of the public, members of the press to walk around this demonstration if it was, a national threat to public safety? I have a hard time believing that it was that level of danger. Otherwise, there's just no way that, I walked home 10 o'clock at night after work almost every day when that demonstration was here. No, they provided security if we wanted it, but it wasn't, we highly recommend you, or you should be at home in Manitoba from Zoom. There was no communications like that whatsoever. And half the federal cabinet, if not the whole federal cabinet, was in Ottawa, in West Block, in the center of it. So that's really what just doesn't seem to make sense at all. If it was that much of a threat, there's just no way with our Zoom capabilities that would have been permitted.
Yeah, absolutely. And what the justification at the time that was used, I remember the Public Safety Minister, Marco Mendicino, going up in Parliament saying, we're concerned about weapons. And of course, our colleague Dane Lloyd talked to the agencies, the police agencies involved. They didn't find any firearms. We see Blacklock's reporter, if to our viewers and listeners, if you haven't checked it out, please do. They're doing a great job covering it, just talking about the various sides, but they're talking about memos from national security agencies that did not see the threat needed to justify invoking the Emergencies Act.
And the Liberals were really drawing on a lot of different things that we found out later were not accurate. Many of them said that Convoy protesters started a fire in an apartment building. We later found out that that wasn't connected at all to the protesters. They tried to connect that group of sort of armed extremists in the Coots area with the organizers in Ottawa, and yet there was no legitimate link found between those two. But Minister Minichino repeatedly made that link, insinuating that, oh, there's guns over here and they're connected to here, so there must be guns here. But there was no evidence at all. No, he's a former Crown prosecutor, so he knows the importance of being careful with your words, so it's quite surprising that he was so flippant in that regard. He also said, most memorably, that the police had asked for the Emergencies Act.
Yes, that's another thing, yes.
You know, which sort of invokes that national security, public safety thought in people's minds, and yet we found out that not a single police force asked for this. And in fact, some are saying now that they never did need any of the powers, as we saw with the RCMP at the border blockades. So again, another falsehood. So that really begs the question of what else were they not telling the truth about, or exaggerating, or sort of playing fast and loose with the words. And it would be one thing for one of their other policies. I mean, we've come to expect this from the Liberal government, not being overly transparent or straight up or honest with Canadians. But when it comes to curtailing charter rights and invoking the most powerful law in the land that's supposed to be reserved for extreme deadly circumstances or extreme national security threats, it just is unacceptable. And it sets quite a dangerous threshold for the future, which we could talk about, which is really my primary concern with this.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't want to get to a point where any government, I don't care what stripe it is, Conservative, Liberal, NDP, just uses this as a way to move people away that they don't agree with.
Right. Well, remember,
that's a very dangerous line to cross.
It is. It really is. And that's the sort of thing we see in sort of tyrannical authoritarian regimes around the world, not Canada. You know, and so it's quite serious what the actions of the emergency powers allowed. They froze bank accounts of Canadians with no due process. Now, in normal times, police can freeze bank accounts, but you have to go through the courts because Canadians have charter rights that protect them from governments just unilaterally seizing their assets and things like that. But so a number of Canadians had their bank accounts seized. They couldn't pay their mortgages. They couldn't pay their bills. I had constituents saying they were pulling out thousands of dollars, canceling credit cards. It really drove a lot of fear into the minds of Canadians. I don't know if that was the outcome they were hoping to achieve, to dissuade people from protesting, possibly. But regardless, it was a very serious infringement on charter rights if that threshold wasn't met and therefore the justification wasn't there. They also, of course, we have freedom of assembly as a key charter right in Canada, that you can go and you could protest on public property at any time so long as you're peaceful and lawful. But they made an entire perimeter around Ottawa, where protests and demonstrations have been happening since really the dawn of Canadian Confederation, so to speak, and a very important part of our democracy. And there's protests happening all the time. We see them all the time. Now, not quite to this scale necessarily, but so to say you're not allowed to gather here. Now, again, that may be justified if that threshold was met, but was it met? We don't think so. And the last thing I'll say is the Emergencies Act also allowed them to put almost like pockets of saying no charter rights on assembly here, wherever they wanted. So the government could have said, oh, Winnipeg legislature, no charter rights for assembly there. Downtown Calgary can't assemble there. And so without that justification, that's pretty serious because, again, we value our charter. And to think that they can just unilaterally do that is quite intimidating, to think about the long-term consequences of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even for the people within the downtown core, we saw some and heard some in testimony talk about their experiences. It's still, I get that their lives were disrupted, and I understand, I get it. It still does not meet that threshold to bring in the Emergencies Act. And I think that's the point of all this. Did it meet the threshold? Yes or no? Whether or not you liked the convoy, you didn't like the convoy, it didn't matter. Did it meet the threshold to bring in the highest piece of legislation in the land? And I think that still says no, while at the same time it came out in testimony, and I'm sure you know this, that when the province of Ontario declared a state of emergency, the law enforcement did have that power to start moving trucks out, compelling tow truck companies to do work for them to move some of the trucks away. So that had already started in motion. The Emergencies Act really just went way above what was necessary.
Well, it's odd to think that I mean, countless protests have been broken. Of course, there's laws on the books that allow police to break up things like riots or enforce tow truck drivers to tow vehicles that are blocking roads. Of course, there's laws on the books to maintain law and order. Why weren't those invoked? Well, this is an area of discussion at the Emergencies Act. People aren't quite sure. And I haven't heard a compelling reason of why Ottawa Police or the local government here did not move forward with sort of preparing for this as they saw those thousands of trucks or hundreds of trucks roll across the country. It was quite the phenomenon. I'll never forget those sights, like most Canadians. But again, I think the Liberal government would love to have this sort of pinned on another level of government or this police in Ottawa or the City of Ottawa Council or whatever. But let's remember why they were here in the first place. Why was the Freedom Convoy, thousands of people mobilized to come down to Ottawa? Hundreds of them stayed for 3 weeks, rightfully or wrongfully, illegally. We know they were parked illegally. And thousands more donated. Like they raised, what, $11 million within days? Like, why did this happen? Well, it wasn't in response to something the City of Ottawa did. It was in response to Justin Trudeau's message during the pandemic. Short and simple.
Yep.
They were protesting against lockdowns and the harms that those did on their businesses and their mental health of their children and themselves. And they were protesting against being forced to take health decisions that they didn't believe in or trust. That's what they were protesting, which is solely with the federal government and frankly some provincial governments who, although during the 2 years of the pandemic that those were enforced really or being undertaken, were taking direction from the federal government and their health authorities. So I think a lot of the blame should be placed, in my perspective, on the Liberals' lack of leadership or their type of leadership during the pandemic. That's what inspired or motivated or enraged all of these people to come all the way across Canada to sort of set up camp in Ottawa to protest against Justin Trudeau. So the idea that Trudeau they're perhaps trying to maneuver to pin this on Ottawa, or maybe that's what will end up happening with this inquiry, I think is wrong place in that regard. I think, again, why were they here? Well, it was Justin Trudeau's decisions that brought them here. Absolutely.
Well, two things you said there I just want to pick up quickly. The city did have time to prepare. I think what's coming out is they didn't realize the size or maybe the impact that it would have. But if you look at Toronto, when the second convoy started up, that Toronto police were able to, and OPP were able to move the people along and keep them moving, and it lasted, what, a day, I think, so. and then it was gone. The second point, too, to all of this is that if you rewind the clock, countries like the United Kingdom were removing their restrictions, and at the time, Canada was putting in restrictions. Like, it seemed that they were using the force of government instead of trusting Canadians to use their best judgment based on the conditions and the information provided to them. And I think that's what irked a lot of people in all of this. We're just being forced to deal with government that at times was going in the opposite direction in many countries of the world.
Right. And again, we don't support law breaking or blockading of any kind. That being said, I was not surprised that this happened. I think any member of parliament who was surprised that this happened was clearly not paying attention or taking those tough phone calls from their small business owners, from the widowed women living in tiny apartments that were elderly, that were just hoping to die because they couldn't spend any more time alone. Or the parents who called me whose children didn't want to eat. They ever developed eating disorders because they had lost complete control of their lives, couldn't see their friends, couldn't join sports, had no outlet, were stuck in front of Instagram all day. It was incredibly traumatizing, not to mention the division caused by mandates, which were certainly supported and talked about a lot from Justin Trudeau during the last election. People forget, but a year ago, in Manitoba and elsewhere, you could not have anyone at a wedding, a funeral, a birthday party, a conference of any kind if there was one unvaccinated person. So in Manitoba, if you wanted to have a wedding and let's say your cousin or your brother was unvaccinated, either that person couldn't come or they were the only one who could come. So imagine the tension that creates, trying to have a funeral and your uncle and auntie can't come to their father's funeral because they're not vaccinated. Like, imagine what that does and the anger and the fracturing that has in a family. And so I think that all of that combined with job losses and the trauma of the whole experience, I mean, is anyone really surprised that this happens? Doesn't make the law breaking justified. I just think it was like an outlet, like a pressure release
Well,
valve.
don't even forget the Prime Minister was calling them names
this
all the
is
time.
another thing.
And this was before the campaign. We don't want a two-tiered society. We don't want vaccinated versus unvaccinated.
Thousands of times he
that's
said
from the
that.
Prime Minister. Okay, agreed on that.
Yeah.
Then the election was called, the one that nobody wanted in 2019. The Prime Minister's polls numbers started to drop. They're on the free fall down. What does he do? Well, I need to divide the public even more. I need to find a group of people we can turn on and make them the bad people for everybody's woes at that time. Right? And it was the unvaccinated. And all of a sudden, just like that, he turned.
And
just like that.
And dehumanized people. Painted them as sort of a danger to society and said, I'll never forget when I saw this clip on Twitter. He was, at a Liberal rally yelling into a microphone that you have the right not to get vaccinated, but you have no right to sit next to someone who is. That's the most powerful man in the country saying that. What kind of message, sort of leadership is that providing to all the people who follow him? I mean, that is significant. And so what happens 6 months later, there's this occupation or this demonstration in Ottawa. I think that his actions had serious ramifications. Of course, he can't be solely blamed, but I certainly think he carries the weight of most of what happened and has yet to apologize or live up to it. And all those terrible things he said. I mean, he called unvaccinated people like racist and misogynistic and anti-science and every name in the book. And it's like, this is the Prime Minister of Canada. It's shocking.
He's supposed to be the Prime Minister of all Canadians.
Of all Canadians, This is the guy who says diversity is our strength. And yet he was so keen to divide Canadians. And we know even from Liberal backbenchers that was a calculated decision. Joel Lightbound.
Yes.
Bravely and famously came out and said, this is, I'm paraphrasing, but this is enough. I don't agree with this approach. What we did in the election was wrong, and we need to stop dividing people. Good on him for coming forward.
Yeah, that was very brave.
It was very brave, and rare that you see that in a governing party that a backbencher speaks, at least not in the Canada system. We talk about the UK system, a little different, but yeah. So not to make light of any of this, but I think it's tough to almost start reliving this again. I don't know if others are thinking this, but that Convoy was a sort of a monumental shake in Canada, and was a response to 2 years of trauma, in my opinion. Now we're rehashing some of that, and that can be tough. But we'll see what happens. I have faith in our judicial process. This is an inquiry that was built into legislation because it's so serious to invoke this act that the creators of this act, and what was it, the late 1980s, built in an inquiry mechanism to investigate this, because anytime it's invoked, it needs to have a lengthy inquiry. I think that's fairly...
Absolutely.
I don't know any
that
other...
says it all, right?
That says a lot.
Yes.
So anyway, we'll see how it goes, Jamie. We'll be paying close attention.
Yeah, we'll see what comes out of this. We'll see if they did meet that threshold.
We'll find out.
We'll find out. So thank you very much, Raquel Dancho, Member of Parliament for Kildonan St. Paul, also the public safety critic for the Conservative Party of Canada. We do appreciate you coming and joining us here on the show. We ask that you like, subscribe, share this program, comment as well. Tell us what you think. What did you think of the show? Also, if you can't watch or listen to it right this second, listen to it on platforms like CastBox, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, you name it. It is out there. Tell your friends about that as well. We'll be back next week at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time every single Tuesday with new content for you. But until then, remember, low taxes, less government, more freedom. That's the blueprint.